She is sitting on the guardrail of a highway you have never heard of, in a county you could not find on a map, and she is doing the only thing left to do, which is nothing. The phone is in her lap. The screen is cracked in a spider web from a fall that happened 11 months ago and was never worth fixing. She is not looking at it. She is looking at the empty stretch of gravel behind her truck, where a crate should be, where a leash should be pooled in the dust, where a dog with a marked medical vest should be standing with his ears up, watching her face the way he has been trained to watch it for 14 months, waiting for the tremor in her hands that comes 11 minutes before the seizure does. She does not have 11 minutes today, she has 31, and she knows this the way soldiers know the weather is turning, some old animal sense underneath language, and she is spending them doing math she does not want to do. 62 miles. That is how far away the thing she needs most has been carried, by hands that thought it was funny. You should know, before this goes any further, that this story ends with the dog found. It ends with him alive, walking, home. It ends with the people responsible for this standing in front of the people who love them, answering for it without a single fist raised. That much is promised to you now, at the start, so that what comes next can be walked through slowly, the way it actually happened, not rushed past for the sake of an ending you already have in your pocket. Because right now, on this shoulder, in this heat, none of that has happened yet. Right now there is a woman with a service dog vest still folded in her glove box because the dog who wore it is gone, and a phone with one number in it she trusts enough to call when the world stops holding still, a number that belongs not to a hospital, not to a hotline with a woman's calm recorded voice, but to a clubhouse 40 minutes east, where a retired sergeant-at-arms with hearing, shot half to hell from a war 3 decades gone, is about to pick up a landline and hear her voice crack for the first time since he's known her. 31 minutes. Somewhere behind her, 62 miles closer to a lake most people have never heard of, 3 teenagers are watching a video they filmed on a phone, laughing, already forgetting what they did. They do not know yet that there are 67 men and women who are about to spend their evening making sure they remember. Stay with this one to the end. Tell us in the comments what town you're watching from. You'll want to see how far this reaches before it's done. 18 months before that morning outside the feed store, she was still learning how to drive again. Not the mechanics of it. Her hands remembered the wheel, her feet remembered the pedals, but the trust of it, the animal faith that a road would stay a road, and a car would stay upright. That trust had been taken from her on a 2-lane stretch outside a base town, at night, in rain nobody had forecast, when the truck she was riding in left the pavement at 61 miles an hour and did not come back onto it. She had walked away with a concussion and a collarbone that healed crooked. The friend beside her had not walked away at all. She did not talk about that part yet. She would not talk about it for a long time. It sat in her the way shrapnel sits in men who swear they don't feel it anymore, until weather changes and they do. What the crash left her with, the doctors explained in a clinic that smelled like hand sanitizer and old coffee, was a seizure disorder, not epilepsy exactly, something the paperwork called post-traumatic in origin, something that came without much warning and left her on floors, in parking lots, once on the shoulder of a highway, with strangers' hands on her shoulders asking her name. She had been a soldier who prided herself on control. Now her own body would occasionally decide, without asking her, to fall. She was discharged 9 months after the crash, honorably, with a folder of paperwork and a pension that covered rent if she was careful. She moved back near Iron Ridge because it was cheap and because there was nothing left in her old life to hold her elsewhere. A caseworker at the VA, the kind of tired, decent woman who has seen 100 cases like this and still calls each one by name, put her in touch with a nonprofit 2 states over that trained dogs for people like her, people whose bodies gave no warning before they gave out. 14 months ago, a trainer with a clipboard and sunburned forearms handed her a leash attached to a young Belgian Malinois mix with amber eyes and a nose that never seemed to stop working, and said, not unkindly, that the dog would learn her faster than she'd learn the dog. He was right. Within weeks, the animal could read something in her scent, her sweat, some chemical shift 20 minutes before a seizure hit, and would plant himself against her legs, refusing to move, until she sat down on whatever floor was nearest. He wore a vest that said "Service Dog, Do Not Pet," and she had it monitored, tagged, medically registered, because a stranger's kindness could undo a year of training in one careless approach. She had built her whole unraveling life around the discipline of that dog, which was why, 31 minutes into a Tuesday that had started ordinary, her hands would not stop shaking on a payphone she hadn't used in years, because the one thing standing between her and the floor had been carried off by 3 boys who thought a crate on a truck bed was nothing more than a joke worth filming. Before the phone, before the boys, before the crate went missing from the truck bed, there had been a rhythm to her days. Thin and careful as a wire, she walked without looking down. The trailer sat on the last lot before the county road gave up its pavement, a single wide with a tin roof that ticked and groaned in the heat like something breathing. Dust settled on everything by 9 in the morning, on the porch rail, on the 2 plastic chairs, on the harness that hung from a nail by the door. Leather darkened where her hand gripped it 1,000 times. She kept the harness there instead of in a closet, because she needed to see it. Some mornings it was the first thing her eyes found. She worked the early shift at a diner off the highway, 4 days a week, refilling coffee for truckers who tipped in quarters, and never asked why a dog with a vest sat under her table without moving. The owner didn't mind. He'd lost a brother to something the papers called service-related, and he never made her explain what she didn't say out loud. The heat came up off the blacktop in visible sheets by 10 a.m., and she'd stand in the doorway during slow stretches watching it warp the horizon. Radar's leash looped twice around her wrist out of habit more than need. Evenings, she drove the truck to the feed store or the pharmacy, windows down, dust devils spinning off the shoulder, the whole town smelling of hot asphalt and cut hay. She spoke to almost no one beyond what the day required. There had been a version of her life with more voices in it. She did not let herself walk that hallway often, and what remained was small, deliberate, built to hold weight without breaking. In the glove box, folded into quarters so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth, was a card with a phone number and 9 words beneath it. Riders Care Network, for veterans, day or night. She had never called it. A woman at the VA office had pressed it into her hand 11 months ago, back when she was sleeping in the truck and hadn't yet found the trailer, and she had kept it the way she kept things she didn't examine too closely. Not from sentiment, she told herself, but because throwing it away felt like tempting something. She did not know, yet, what the number would cost her to dial, or what it would summon. She only knew that some nights, driving home under a sky gone the color of a old bruise, she'd glance at the glove box and feel a small, unplaceable comfort, the way a person feels standing near a fire escape in a building that has never caught fire. Tuesday started like any of those days, heat already pressing by 7. Radar's nose lifted once at the door, reading the morning before she'd finished reading it herself. The feed store sat at the north edge of Iron Ridge, a low tin-roofed building with a faded rooster painted above the door, its comb chipped away by 40 years of hail. She had been buying from there since before the crash, since before the trailer, since before Radar wore a vest with a patch that read, "Service Dog, Do Not Pet," in red block letters gone pink from sun. The lot was gravel and hardpan, cracked in long fault lines that widened every August and closed again every winter, and by noon, it threw heat back up at her like a second sun she hadn't asked for. She parked in the shade of the loading dock, the only shade the lot offered, nose in against a stack of pallets that smelled of creosote and old rain. She cracked both windows 2 inches, the way she always did, the way the manual for the crate recommended, and the way 18 months of small, careful habits had taught her, without her noticing she was being taught. The crate sat bolted into the truck bed under a shade cloth she'd rigged herself from a tarp and 2 bungee cords, and Radar climbed into it the moment she opened the tailgate, because that was the sequence, and dogs like sequences the way soldiers like orders. 4 minutes. She had timed it before, more than once, out of the same instinct that made her count exits in restaurants and check mirrors twice at intersections. Feed, a rope toy for a neighbor's kid, maybe a bag of the joint supplement the vet had recommended for his hips. In and out. She had done it 100 times in 100 small towns not so different from this one, and nothing had ever happened, because nothing usually does. because ordinary is what most of life is made of, right up until the day it isn't. She did not look back before she went inside. That detail would return to her later, turned over and over like a stone worn smooth by handling. She had not looked back, had not given herself even one more second of him lifting his head to watch her go, ears up, reading the parking lot the way he read every room and every road, cataloging what belonged and what didn't. Inside, the store smelled of grain dust and machine oil, and the man behind the counter asked how her week was going, and she said fine, the way people do, and picked up a 50-pound bag she didn't need help carrying, because asking for help was still a thing she was relearning how to do. She was reaching for the supplement on the bottom shelf, crouched with her knees cracking the way they had cracked since the accident, when she heard it. Not a bark, not tires, nothing dramatic enough to name, just a stillness in the lot outside that hadn't been there 4 minutes ago, a hush where an engine hum should have been, the specific and terrible silence of a space that has been rearranged. The truck that pulled into the gravel apron beside the feed store was already loud before it arrived, the bass leaking out through rolled-down windows, 3 shapes in the cab still wet-haired from the lake, sunburned across the shoulders, one of them holding a phone up sideways the way boys do when they've decided something is going to be worth remembering. They saw the crate before they saw anything else. A plastic travel kennel strapped down in the bed of a parked truck, door latched, a shape inside it lying still in the heat, with its ears already lifted, already listening, already cataloging 3 new engines and 3 new voices, as things that did not belong. None of them looked at the vest. It was folded partly under the dog's chest, the patch with its small red cross turned toward the floor of the crate, and even if it had been turned upward, none of them were looking for anything that would have required them to stop and read. "Bet you won't," one of them said, and the words were not aimed at the dog, they were aimed at each other, the particular currency of boys who have run out of things to be afraid of that afternoon and have started manufacturing new ones. The one holding the phone laughed, low, already framing the shot. "Dare you to open it." The latch was not complicated. It took 4 seconds, the kind of 4 seconds that would later be measured and remeasured on a screen in a clubhouse 60-some miles away, slowed down frame by frame, by men trying to understand how something so small could take so little time. The door swung. The dog did not lunge and did not growl. He stood and turned his head toward the store, toward the door his person had walked through, and one of the boys said, grab him," and laughed again, the laugh of someone who has not yet learned that some doors, once opened, do not close the same way twice. They lifted him into their own truck bed the way you'd lift a duffel bag, careless rather than cruel, already turning the moment into something to post, already narrating it for an audience that did not exist yet. Check this out, some dog just chilling in a crate. We're basically rescuing him. The phone catching the tailgate, the sun, the grin, none of it catching the leash clipped uselessly to the crate's empty floor, none of it catching the small hitch in the dog's step as he was set down among coolers and wet towels and a spare tire. The truck pulled out of the lot the way it had come in, loud, unhurried, 3 boys already scrolling back through the footage to see how it looked, laughing at a joke that had no punchline yet, driving north away from the feed store and its grain dust smell, carrying with them, though none of them understood it in any way that would matter until much later, the only thing standing between a woman inside and the moment her body might one day fail without warning. She came out of the feed store with a 50-pound sack over one shoulder and the receipt still in her fist, and the parking lot looked exactly as it had 4 minutes before. Same gravel, same heat shimmer over the asphalt seams, same 2 trucks parked nose out by the propane cage, except that hers was wrong in a way her body understood before her mind did. The tailgate stood open at the same angle she'd left it. The crate was gone. She did not drop the sack. She would remember that later, an oddly specific detail to survive the moment intact, that her arm simply held on, rigid, while the rest of her walked forward as if the ground had tilted 2 degrees. Her boots found the tailgate. Her hand found the leash, clipped to nothing, coiled against bare metal where the crate's floor had been. She turned once, a full circle, scanning the lot the way she'd once scanned a compound perimeter, cataloging, no truck she recognized idling nearby, No one standing where they shouldn't be standing. No plate ending in her memory. No faces turned toward her that held guilt instead of indifference. The lot offered her nothing. It simply continued being a lot. Dust, heat, a broken flag rope ticking against its pole, while the one animal trained to know her body's failures before she did, rode farther away with every second she spent standing still. Her hand, when she raised it to her jacket pocket, was shaking badly enough that she had to steady the phone against her hip to unlock it. She did not call 911. The thought arrived and left almost simultaneously. A dispatcher, a report number, a deputy 20 minutes out who would ask her to describe the vehicle she hadn't seen, who would file it under stolen property, animal, estimated value unknown. That was not what this was. This was not property. She scrolled instead to a number she had saved 11 months earlier, under 2 words, no name attached. The way you'd label something you hoped never to need twice. The line rang 3 times before it connected. She said her name before she said anything else, because she'd learned that once, that in an emergency you lead with what you are, not what happened. And then she said, without inflection, because inflection cost energy she didn't have, that her dog was gone. Taken from the truck, no plates, no faces, 4 minutes, maybe 5. There was a pause on the other end, brief, the particular silence of someone recalibrating. Then a voice, older, rough at its edges, in a way that suggested damage rather than temperament, asked her exactly where she was standing, what she could see, what direction the lot faced, whether the sun was behind her or ahead, questions with no comfort in them at all, and for that reason the only questions that steadied her hand enough to answer. She told him, feed store, Iron Ridge, facing east. He told her to stay put and not touch anything else in the truck bed. Then he asked her, quieter, almost like an afterthought that wasn't one, how long since she'd had a warning before a seizure without the dog beside her. She didn't answer that one right away. She hadn't answered right away because the honest answer was 3 days, and 3 days felt like something she should be ashamed of, though she couldn't have said to whom. The dog had been the buffer between her and that number for 14 months. Without him, 3 days was not a statistic. It was a countdown with no clock face, just a low hum under everything she did. The voice on the other end didn't push. It let the silence sit the way a person lets a fire burn down, before adding more wood, and in that pause she understood, the way you understand weather before it arrives, that this was not the first time this voice had asked a hard question and waited without flinching for an answer that might not come. He told her his name, a call name, the kind men who'd worn a patch for 30 years answered to more readily than whatever was on their birth certificate, and something in the register of it, low and slightly flattened, like a radio-tuned half-a-click-off station, made her go still. She knew that voice. 11 months ago, it had come through a different phone, in a different kind of desperation, when she'd been sleeping in the truck outside a shuttered VA office and hadn't known where a woman with a service animal and a disability rating and no fixed address was supposed to go next. That voice had asked her then, too, not why she'd ended up there, only what she needed and where she was standing, and inside 2 days there had been a room with a working lock and a landlord who didn't ask questions about the seizures. He didn't say he remembered her. He didn't need to. The chapter he answered for didn't run on sentiment, or at least didn't advertise it. A clubhouse 2 exits off the interstate, a phone line that rang through to whoever was closest, a rotating watch of men with hearing aids and old service medals in coffee cans, who had learned somewhere along the way that competence was a form of mercy, maybe the only form some of them had left in them. His hearing had gone in one ear entirely, and half in the other, decades back, in a place he never named, and she never asked about, and it made him lean into the phone like he was listening for something under the words, rather than the words themselves. He didn't ask why she'd called this number instead of the police. He didn't ask what the boys had looked like or whether she'd gotten a plate, because she'd already told him there wasn't one. He asked her, a second time, exactly where she was standing. Then he told her not to move, not even to sit in the truck's shade, because sitting still would help nothing, and moving carelessly might disturb whatever ground truth was left in that gravel lot. A scent trail, a print, a torn scrap of nylon vest catching light in a way she hadn't thought to look for yet. She stood where she was told to stand, in the widening heat of a morning that had not yet decided how cruel it meant to be, and counted the minutes by the sound of gravel settling under her own boots. The first motorcycle came at the 31-minute mark. She knew this because she had started counting the moment she hung up, the way she had once counted seconds between incoming and impact, a habit her body had never unlearned and her mind had stopped fighting. The rider was heavy-set, gray-bearded, wearing a vest gone soft and gray-white at the shoulders from 30 years of weather. He did not introduce himself. He walked the perimeter of her truck twice, slow, eyes down, the way a man reads a floor for a leak before he reads a room for danger, and then he pulled a folded road atlas from his saddlebag, its spine cracked white, its pages swollen with old rain. By the time the ninth rider arrived, someone had produced a sheet of yellow legal paper and a pen tied to a length of paracord, and every man who rolled into that gravel lot signed his name and the time he arrived before he did anything else, before he looked at her, before he looked at the empty crate mouth still zip-tied open in the truck bed, before he said a single word of comfort, which none of them seemed inclined to offer, as if comfort were a currency to be spent later, after the work. The atlas came open across the hood of a pickup borrowed for the purpose. Someone produced a nub of blue chalk from a tackle box. 3 counties were divided into sectors with lines drawn straight and unhurried, township roads and county lines translated into geometry, into something that could be walked and searched and crossed off, and she watched a woman with cropped gray hair and a torn ear stud call out mile markers to a man writing them down without asking her to repeat herself twice. No one raised his voice. No one asked what kind of dog, though most of them clearly did not know, and one man, younger than the rest, patches still stiff and new-smelling, asked only whether the vest had a name patch or a phone number stitched into it, because that was the detail that would matter 60 miles down a highway to a stranger who might find him first. By the 40-minute mark, there were 11 signatures on the yellow paper and 4 sectors already claimed, chalk dust ghosting the folds of the atlas like frost that refused to melt in the heat. The retired sergeant stood apart from all of it, phone still against his good ear, relaying numbers to someone she couldn't hear, his mouth moving with the flat economy of a man who had given orders before, under circumstances that made this one look almost gentle by comparison. She realized, standing there, that she had stopped shaking somewhere in the last 10 minutes without noticing the exact moment it happened. The sergeant lowered the phone at last and turned toward her, and the way he moved his whole body to face her, rather than just his head, told her he had learned somewhere that hearing loss made a man honest in ways he might not have chosen for himself. He asked her the dog's name first, and she gave it, and he wrote it in block letters at the top of a fresh page instead of adding it to the atlas margins, as if the animal deserved its own sheet of paper, separate from the roads. Then he asked what commands the dog answered to, and she found herself reciting them the way she might recite her own service number. Flat, automatic, a list that had lived in her mouth so long it no longer felt like language. Down. Alert. Cover. Find. He asked what the dog was afraid of, and she said thunder, said it quietly, said that during storms he pressed himself against her legs, like he could absorb the sound through his own body if he tried hard enough. The sergeant wrote. Storm. Press behavior. Without looking up, and something in the clinical shorthand of it steadied her more than any comfort would have. He asked about the collar tag last, its exact wording, whether it listed a phone number or only a name, and she gave him both, and he read it back to her once to confirm, before folding the page and passing it to a man near the door, without another word between them. While he asked these things, another rider, heavy-set, sunburned at the collar, hands scarred in a pattern that suggested welding work rather than fighting, had crouched beside her without asking permission, taken her wrist between 2 fingers, and counted silently against his own watch. He asked when she'd last eaten. She told him. He asked if she felt the aura yet, the metallic taste, the tunnel narrowing at the edges of her sight, using words that told her he had either lived with a seizure disorder himself or loved someone who had. She said no, not yet, and he nodded and did not touch her again, only stayed close enough that she understood, without it being said, that she would not be left alone even for the length of time it took someone else to bring her water. No one asked her how she was holding up. No one told her it would be fine. They treated her like a piece of equipment that needed calibrating before it could be trusted back into the field, and she found, to her own quiet surprise, that this was the kindest thing anyone had done for her since the accident, to be handled with competence instead of pity, to be kept functional rather than consoled. The sergeant folded the atlas closed on its final marked sector and looked up at the room full of vests and static. 62 miles, he said. Let's go get him. The count came the way a muster comes, not a rally, someone reading numbers off a clipboard while the room settled into the particular quiet of men who had done head counts before, in other lives, for other reasons. 67. The sergeant said it twice, once to the room and once into the radio clipped at his collar, as if the number itself needed confirming before it could be trusted to hold weight. 3 counties. He'd drawn them onto the atlas earlier that morning in yellow chalk, the kind used on shop floors to mark where a part had failed, and now he traced the borders again with a blunt finger for the benefit of the newer riders, the ones who had never been handed a sector and told it was theirs to lose. The back roads were gridded like something surveyed for war. Route 9 split into feeder roads that split again into gravel tracks that had names only the county recorder still remembered, and each one was assigned to a pairing. Never a rider alone, the sergeant said, not on this. Not on a search where a man might find something he'd need another set of eyes to confirm he was really seeing. A retired trucker who ran the fuel stop off the interstate volunteered his CB network without being asked twice. Patched in a dozen long-haul drivers who owed him diesel money or favors older than that, men who would now be watching the shoulders of highways they crossed 100 times a month without ever once looking at what lived in the ditches. Gas station clerks in 3 towns were given a description: Malinois mix, tan and black, medical vest, torn, and told to call the number taped beside their register if a dog matching it wandered into their lot looking for water. It was not urgency that moved through the room. Urgency burned fast and often burned wrong. This was something slower and more durable, the discipline of men who had learned, usually the hard way, that a search conducted in a panic covered less ground than one conducted in silence. The sign-in sheet passed from hand to hand, each rider printing a name, a bike number, a sector, the ink smearing slightly under a thumb still damp from the last cup of coffee. A young woman near the back, new patch, boots still stiff at the ankle, signed her name last and looked at the sector assigned to her longer than the others had, as though trying to memorize the exact bend of road before she'd even seen it. The sergeant clipped the radio back to his collar and looked once toward the woman still seated in the corner, wrapped now in someone's jacket, watching all of it happen around her the way a person watches weather they no longer have the strength to be afraid of. Then the engines began, one after another, the sound rolling outward from the lot like something enormous exhaling for the first time in years. The first hour produced nothing but heat and the long, patient static of tires on gravel roads that led nowhere in particular. Riders called in at intervals, their voices flattened by the CB's compression, each report a variation on the same sentence. Nothing here, moving to the next marker. The chalked sectors on the atlas filled in slowly, section by section, like a wound being cleaned rather than closed. No dog, no crate, no sign that anything living had passed through the ditches and turnoffs assigned to them. She sat where she had been left, in the corner of the clubhouse, the borrowed jacket heavy on her shoulders despite the heat outside. Her hands would not stay still. She noticed this herself, distantly, the way a person notices a stranger's habit, fingers finding each other, twisting, releasing, finding again. She did not try to stop them. She had learned, over 18 months, that trying to stop her hands only told her body there was something worth panicking about, and panic was the one door she could not afford to open without knowing what waited behind it. The young prospect had not gone out with the others. She had been told to hold the second radio, to relay from the base of the lot in case the signal dropped on the east ridge, and she had taken the assignment without complaint, though her stiff boots and the way she kept glancing toward the door suggested she would rather have been on the road with everyone else. Instead, she stood near the corner, close enough that her shadow crossed the edge of the woman's chair, and for a long while she said nothing at all. Then she crouched, unhurried, the way a person crouches near an animal they don't want to startle. "Does that happen a lot?" she asked, nodding at the hands. "The moving like that?" No one else had asked her anything all day that wasn't about the dog, the truck, the boys, the road. Not her name, not her hands, not the 18 months that had rearranged the shape of her days into a geometry no one outside a hospital would understand. "When I'm scared," she said. "Or before. Sometimes before." The prospect nodded slowly, filing it away the way a soldier files away terrain, not for sympathy, but for use. "So if it starts," she said, "I should know what before looks like." It was not comfort, not exactly. It was closer to reconnaissance, and something in the plainness of it settled the woman more than any soft word could have. She studied the prospect's face, young, sun-browned, unmarked yet by whatever years would eventually put there, and found in it none of the performance she had grown used to bracing against. Only attention, only the particular stillness of someone who had decided, without announcement, that this stranger's hands were now hers to watch. Outside, the radio hissed once, then again, and neither of them moved toward it yet, waiting to hear whether the static would resolve into words. The static resolved into nothing, a trucker's voice asking about way station traffic near a county line neither of them cared about, and faded again, and the woman found she had been holding her breath for it without meaning to. She let it go slowly, the way she had learned to let go of most things. "There was someone else in the truck," she said. 18 months ago, a friend from my unit. We'd both made it home in one piece, which felt like it should have counted for something." The prospect did not fill the silence that followed. She had learned that much already, in a single day, from women who talked in fragments and needed the fragments left alone. "Rain," the woman said. "Not much. Enough. A deer, maybe." "I don't remember the deer. I remember the sound the truck made after, which isn't a sound I can describe to anyone who hasn't heard it." She looked at her own hands then, turning them over as if checking for something that might have changed. "She died before the ambulance. I didn't. That's the whole story, if you want it short." "I don't need it short," the prospect said. The woman almost smiled at that, though nothing about her face moved in a way that could be called a smile. "For a year after, I didn't sleep more than an hour at a time. The seizures came mostly at night, which the doctors said was common, like that was supposed to help. I'd wake up on the floor, or in the bathtub, or once in the yard, and I never remembered getting there." She glanced toward the truck bed, empty now, the crate door still hanging open on its hinge. "He came 14 months ago. Some woman from the nonprofit brought him to my porch on a Tuesday and told me he'd smell it before I felt it. The seizure, I mean. Told me to trust him even when I didn't understand why he was pushing against my leg for no reason I could see. Did you?" "Not at first. First few weeks I fought him on it. Old habit, I guess, from a life where trusting the wrong signal got people killed." She exhaled through her nose, something almost like a laugh but without the lightness a laugh usually carries. "Then one night he woke me 40 seconds before it started, pushed me onto my side on the mattress instead of the floor, and stayed against my back until it passed. That was the first night in a year I went back to sleep after. Not around it, through it." The radio crackled again, longer this time, and both of them turned toward it, but it was only static resolving into static, nothing yet worth the holding of breath. "That's what he is," she said. "Not a dog, a door that stays open so I can walk back through." The static gave way to a voice, thin and stretched by distance, asking for a repeat on the sector designation. Someone read back a number. The road atlas on the hood had gone soft at the corners from handling, chalk dust ghosting across 3 counties in uneven grids, and she watched the sergeant trace a finger along Route 9 the way a man might trace a scar he'd had long enough to stop noticing, except tonight he was noticing. The call came through the CB, not the hotline, one of the truckers, a woman who ran produce twice a week between the coast and the interior towns, who'd pulled into a station 62 miles out for fuel and diesel exhaust fluid, and had heard, before she even saw the truck, the sound of an engine idling too long at the pump, and something underneath it that didn't belong to any engine. Barking. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. Dogs rode in flatbeds all through this part of the state, tied or crated or just braced against the cab window, panting into the wind like it was the only luxury they'd ever been given. The clerk remembered more, once someone thought to ask. He'd come out from behind the register because the pump had frozen mid-transaction, and he'd needed to reset it, and in that walk from the counter to the concrete he'd noticed 3 of them, all young, all loud in the particular way that boys are loud when they think no adult is listening closely enough to matter. One had laughed at something in the flatbed. Another had reached back and knocked twice on something metal, like a man testing a drum for hollowness. The clerk hadn't seen a dog. He'd heard one, and that was enough for him to remember the time. A little past 2, he said, because his shift changed at 3, and he recalled thinking he'd have to hurry the register count before the next man came on. The sergeant wrote none of this down. He didn't need to. He had already turned toward the hood of the truck where the Atlas lay open, and he laid 2 fingers on the stretch of highway that ran east from the station, following it the way you'd follow a vein to find where the bleeding started. 2 o'clock, he said. 62 out. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. But 3 riders near the tailgate straightened without being told. The particular stillness of men recalibrating a search they'd thought was still wide when it had, in the space of one remembered knock on metal, become narrow enough to walk. Callie felt something tighten low in her chest. Not hope exactly, not yet, but its quieter cousin, the sense of a door swinging, however slightly, toward open. She looked at the radio, willing it toward the next static, the next voice, the next inch of highway that would bring her dog's shape back into a world that had gone, for 4 minutes outside a feed store, unbearably wide. The call came at 4:40, and it did not come as a shout. It came as a single word, repeated twice, flat and careful, the way a man reports a casualty he has not yet allowed himself to feel. Crate, crate. The rider who found it had pulled his bike onto the shoulder near a boat ramp where the county had once planned a picnic area, and then abandoned the idea the way it abandoned most plans out here, leaving a gravel apron, a rusted trash barrel, and a ditch grown thick with Johnson grass. The crate lay on its side 8 feet down the slope, door sprung, one corner caved as if it had been dropped rather than set, and the zip tie that had bound the latch hung, cut clean in half, its plastic edges sharp enough that whoever cut it had used something with an edge, not teeth, not patience. No dog. The word traveled the CB net, the way bad news travels through a hospital hallway, quietly, each listener passing it forward without embellishment, because embellishment was a luxury for people who did not yet understand what silence like this could mean. The sergeant heard it and did not speak for the length of 3 full breaths, and in that gap Callie understood, the way she had understood certain silences in another country a long time ago, that the pause itself was information. He was doing the arithmetic men do when a search stops being about finding and starts being about what finding might cost. She made herself walk to the tailgate and look at the Atlas rather than at any of their faces. The boat ramp sat where the highway bent hard against a drainage cut, and past that bend, the asphalt ran straight and open for almost a mile, the kind of straightaway where trucks did 70 without slowing, where a dog confused and thirsty and running loose might not understand the difference between a road and a field. Nobody said the word hit, nobody said the word gone, but she saw one of the younger riders glance toward that straightaway and then look away fast, the particular look of a man deciding not to imagine something and failing. The sergeant crouched at the ditch's edge and studied the crate without touching it, the way he might have studied a door in a house he didn't trust, then turned his head toward the grass around it, inch by inch, the discipline of a man who had learned decades ago that panic finds nothing a search grid wouldn't have found anyway. He came out on his own, he said finally. Nobody carried him out. Grass here's bent one direction only. It was not comfort. It was only a fact, offered the way he offered all his facts, without decoration, and Callie took it anyway, held it the way she'd once held a compress against a wound that would not yet tell her how deep it went, and looked east, where the straightaway ran on, empty and shimmering, toward whatever the next quarter mile intended to reveal. The call came over the CB at 9 minutes past 4, and it did not sound like victory. It sounded like a man reading numbers off a gas pump, flat and procedural, because that was the only voice he trusted himself to use out loud on an open channel with 60 other riders listening. "Service road," he said. "Half-mile off Route 9, behind the old irrigation pump station. Tracks crossing into the creek bed." He asked for the sergeant by call sign, not by name, and said nothing else until the sergeant arrived, dust rising behind his bike in a long gray curtain that took its time settling. The creek bed was dry, had been dry for weeks, the kind of cracked clay bottom that held a print, the way wet cement holds a handprint. Not perfectly, but enough. 4 toes, no claw drag, spaced in a rhythm that any of them who'd hunted or trained dogs recognized without needing to say it aloud. A trot, not a limp, not yet, moving with purpose across the bed and up the far bank where the grass thickened. It was the barbed wire that stopped conversation altogether. A rider working the fence line, an older man with a wind-burned neck and a habit of talking to himself while he searched, found it snagged 3 feet off the ground, caught on a barb the way cloth catches on anything sharp enough to hold it. He didn't call out right away. He stood there a moment, turning it in his fingers, and only when he was certain did he raise his hand, not his voice, and wait for the others to notice. It was nylon. Gray-blue, the specific shade the nonprofit used, with a strip of reflective tape half torn from its edge and a fragment of stitched lettering that once said, "In full, medical alert, service dog." Now it said MED and part of an A, snagged and fluttering slightly in a wind that had picked up out of nowhere, the way wind does in the late afternoon on a highway with nothing to block it. Callie held it the way she'd held the sergeant's earlier fact about the crate, carefully, without letting her hands shake in front of people who were watching her not shake. The vest had been on him 14 months. She knew its wear pattern the way she knew the callus map of her own palms. This was not a piece torn in play. This was a piece torn in passage, low to the ground, at running height, the exact height a dog moves through wire when he is trying to get somewhere and not trying to get caught. He was moving. He was hurt enough to leave a piece of himself on a fence and not hurt enough to stop. The sergeant looked at the tier, then at the tree line beyond the fence, dense and dark green against a sky just beginning to lower toward evening, and said the only thing he allowed himself to say out loud. "He's headed for shade." Light went out of the sky the way it does in that country, not gradually but in stages, each one a small subtraction. First the gold, then the pink at the edge of the tree line, then the blue that isn't really blue, just the memory of it, and then nothing but the shapes of things standing darker than the dark around them. The temperature dropped the way it always did once the sun quit doing its work, a cooling that came up through the boot soles before it touched the skin. Someone produced flashlights from saddlebags, a dozen of them, then 2 dozen, small disciplined beams that swept low and slow across the ditch grass instead of high and wide across nothing, because a hurt animal close to the ground does not show itself to a light aimed at the horizon. The sergeant had ridden back to the truck once, briefly, to use the CB, and came back with an instruction that traveled rider to rider, the way instructions travel when no one wants to raise a voice. Not his name. She said not to call his name. She said call the word. The word was 1 syllable, flat, a command word, not an endearment, the kind of word that had been drilled into an animal before it was ever a friend, so that even in fear, even lost, even running blind through brush at a height that tore vests off him, some old obedience might answer where affection could not reach him anymore. Riders who had spent 30 years learning to project their voices over engine noise now practiced saying one word softly, into hedgerows, into culverts they hadn't found yet, into the dark under bridges, testing the shape of it in their mouths like men handling something they'd been told was fragile. She had said it to the sergeant over the radio in a voice gone thin with the effort of staying steady, and he had repeated it back to her twice to be sure he had it right, his damaged ear turned toward the receiver in a posture Callie recognized, the same posture she used listening for the click behind her own eyes that told her a seizure was coming, a listening that had nothing to do with hoping and everything to do with training. Now the word moved down the line of searchers like something passed hand to hand in the dark, each rider saying it low, waiting, saying it again, the beams crossing and uncrossing over grass that gave back nothing but its own late summer stillness. Trucks idled at intervals along the shoulder, with their headlights angled into the brush to widen the search without blinding it. Somewhere behind them, a semi passed slow on the highway, its driver's spotlight briefly joining the others, sweeping the tree line once before it rolled on into the dark toward wherever it was going, leaving them the sound of its engine fading, and then nothing but the word, again and again, small and patient, moving toward the culvert none of them could see yet. The prospect found the culvert by its shape before she found anything in it, a low concrete throat where the drainage ditch dipped under the frontage road, half choked with dead grass and a summer's accumulation of silt. She had been walking the ditch line for 11 minutes with her flashlight held low, the way she'd been taught that afternoon by a man twice her age who said light held high only blinds what's hiding, and it was the low angle that caught the shine of an eye somewhere back in the dark throat of the pipe, small and wet and still. She stopped. She did not call out. She had been told what would happen if she called out, that a frightened animal reads a raised voice as a threat closing distance, that stillness was its own kind of language, maybe the only one that mattered right now. She lowered herself onto one knee in the wet grass and clicked the radio once, a habit rather than a signal, and said into it, low, that she thought she had eyes on him, and to hold positions, and to keep quiet. Then she did what she had been told to do if this moment ever came. She had asked the veteran, hours before over the phone relay, what the dog's name sounded like in her mouth, not the letters of it, but the shape, the pitch, the particular falling note at the end that a trained ear would know from a stranger's imitation. Sargent had passed it along word for word, twice repeated, and the prospect had practiced it under her breath in the truck without knowing why until now. She said the name the way it had been described to her, soft, two-toned, dropping at the end like a question answered rather than asked. Nothing moved for 4 full seconds. Then the shine in the dark shifted, and there was the faint drag of something limping over silt, and a shape came half out of the culvert's mouth into the low wash of her flashlight, vest torn at one strap, one hind leg held wrong, tongue out, ribs visible enough to count. He did not come further. He stopped at the lip of the pipe and looked at her with an animal's flat exhaustion, unwilling yet to trust the tone in a voice that did not belong to the one who owned it. She said the name again, the same falling note, and did not move toward him. She clicked the radio and said, quiet, that she needed the phone brought down to the ditch, now, and that no one else should come closer than the road. She could hear boots already moving toward her through the dark, unhurried, disciplined, exactly as they'd been told to be, and beneath that sound, smaller, the wet, uneven breathing of something that had walked farther than anything with 4 legs should have had to walk, waiting to hear the one voice it had been listening for, since the crate lid opened onto a highway shoulder it did not choose. The dog did not resist when the vest strap was cut free, only flinched at the give of nylon along his ribs, and he let himself be lifted onto the tailgate with the boneless cooperation of something too tired to argue with kindness. The Vet Tech patch member knelt in the ditch light with steady hands that had set broken limbs on men twice this animal's weight, and worked his fingers along the hind leg with a slowness that had nothing to do with hesitation and everything to do with care. Not broken, he said finally, to no one and everyone, strained. Maybe a hairline. He'll need imaging, but he'll walk again by morning if we don't let him walk tonight. The prospect held the flashlight steady and did not look away, though the ribs and the raw place at the shoulder, where the vest had chafed through skin, made something tighten behind her sternum that she chose not to name aloud. It was another rider, sitting on the guardrail with his phone lit blue against the dark, who broke the quiet with a single flat word. Found it. He turned the screen so the nearest 3 could see. A video, 14 seconds, posted hours before, the account public, the caption something about dumb dogs and free rides, punctuated with laughing emoji that looked obscene against what the footage actually showed. A crate lifted from a truck bed outside a feed store, 3 faces bright and unbothered in the daylight, one of them narrating for the camera in the easy, untroubled voice of someone who has never once been made to answer for anything. The location tag sat in the corner in small, pale letters. a lake 30 minutes north, and beneath the video a scroll of comments already thickening with laughter from people who did not know, and would not have cared, what the dog was for. No one spoke for a moment. The wind moved through the culvert and carried the smell of wet concrete and diesel, and faintly, the dog's exhaustion. The rider with the phone did not gloat over the find. He only held it out, screen still lit, toward the sergeant who had come down the slope without being asked, moving with the unhurried certainty of a man who has done triage before, in places worse than a drainage ditch off Route 9. He studied the three faces for a long moment, the way a man studies a map he already half knows the roads of. Then he said, quietly, that he wanted names before sunrise and addresses before noon, and that nobody was to comment, share, or reply to a single word of it. Just look, he said, and remember what you're looking at. Someone asked, carefully, whether they should call it in. The nearest sheriff's office was 11 miles east, past a feed co-op and a shuttered motel, and the question hung in the wet air the way questions do when a man is waiting to be told he already knows the answer. The sergeant did not answer right away. He crouched instead beside the culvert's mouth, one hand resting on the dog's flank, feeling the ribs rise and fall under wet fur, and he seemed to be listening to something none of the rest of them could hear. No report, he said finally. Not yet. He said it the way he said most things, without weight, as though the decision had already been made somewhere upstream of the sentence, and he was only now getting around to speaking it aloud. A report would take days to become anything. A deputy would drive out, write down what he was told, and the boys would have a week to agree on a story before anyone asked them a real question. By then the video would be deleted, the comments scrubbed, the laughing strangers scattered back into whatever lives they had before they'd found it funny. Paper moved slow. This would not. And no finding them on some road either, he added, glancing up at the two riders nearest him, men who had gone quiet in a particular way that meant they had already been picturing it. A truck pulled alongside a bicycle, a raised voice, the satisfaction of it. He watched that picture leave their faces one at a time. We're not going to corner 3 kids on a highway, he said. That's not what this is. He stood, slow with the effort of a man whose knees had earned every year of it, and looked down Route 9 toward the lake 30 minutes north, the water they could not see but all now pictured, a dock, a cooler, a phone held sideways. What they were going to do, he said, was drive to 3 houses. They were going to knock. They were going to wait for a parent to open the door, and only then would the phone come out, screen already playing, no need for a single raised word. Let the footage do what a fist never could. Let a father watch his son do it in his own voice, in his own laughter, on his own porch light. He looked at the prospect last, the one who'd found the dog, still kneeling in the mud with Radar's head against her knee, and something in his face eased slightly, the way weather eases before it clears. Get him stable first, he said. Everything else waits on that. Then he turned back toward the road, already counting houses in his head, already deciding in what order the evening would go. The prospect's truck came up Callie's gravel drive a little after 9, headlights cutting long and low across the yard, and Callie was already on the porch before the engine stopped, one hand braced on the rail like she didn't trust her own legs to hold her upright. The window came down first, then the muzzle, gray around the mouth, nose working the air before the rest of him followed, a slow, deliberate unfolding of a body that had learned, in the last 6 hours, to move carefully. Callie didn't run. She walked, the way she'd been taught to walk, toward anything that mattered, and put both hands under his jaw before he was even fully out the window, cupping it the way you'd hold something you were afraid to drop. He leaned into her palms. That was all. No bark, no leap, no frantic circling. Just weight, given over, the whole 100 pounds of him deciding all at once that the arms holding him were the ones he'd been walking toward the entire time, blind and limping, under fences and through creek beds, and beneath a culvert that had smelled like rust and standing water. The prospect cut the engine and sat there a moment with her hands still on the wheel, watching in the rear view without turning around, the way you give a room its privacy even when you're standing in it. Radar's vest was torn along the left shoulder seam, the nylon frayed to threads where the barbed wire had caught him, and one of the medical patches hung by a single stitch. Callie found the tear with her thumb before she found anything else, running the pad of her finger along the frayed edge like she was checking a wound rather than a strap. Then she found the actual wound, the limp favoring the back left, the paw pad scraped raw and packed with dried mud that had already turned black in the porch light. She didn't say anything for a long time. She knelt in the gravel in her sock feet, no shoes, like she'd come outside too fast to remember she needed them, and pressed her forehead briefly against the top of his skull, right where the fur went coarse and gray at the crown. The dog exhaled. It was the only sound either of them made. The prospect finally got out, boots quiet on the gravel, and stood a few feet back with the crate in her arms, the one that had been zip-tied shut near the boat ramp, now empty and light. She held it like she wasn't sure whether to offer it or hide it. Callie looked up once. Her eyes were dry, but something in her jaw had let go, some clench that had likely been there since 4 minutes outside a feed store that afternoon. "Thank you," she said. Just that. The prospect nodded and didn't trust herself to say anything back. The sergeant made 3 stops that night, and he made them in the order the road allowed, not the order of anger, because anger was not what he was carrying. He was carrying a phone with a video already open, thumbnail paused on a boy's grinning face and a crate lid swinging shut, and he carried it the way a man carries a subpoena, flat, unhurried, final. The first house had a basketball hoop with no net and a porch light already on, like they'd been waiting for someone, though not for this. The mother answered. She did not ask why 60-some men in leather had one representative standing on her steps at 9 at night. She only looked at his face and understood that whatever this was, it mattered. He asked to sit at the kitchen table. He always asked to sit. Standing made it a confrontation. Sitting made it a reckoning. He set the phone down and pressed play. The boy's father watched the whole 19 seconds without blinking, jaw working like he was chewing something bitter. The boy watched his own hands on the screen, the crate, the laughing, and would not look up from the table. "Say what you did," the sergeant said, out loud, to them. The boy said it. His voice cracked once, on the word dog, and did not crack again. At the second house, the father opened the door already knowing someone had called ahead, the way small towns always do, and before the video finished playing, he said, quiet, almost to himself, that he'd never once sat this boy down and told him actions came back around, that he'd been too tired most nights, that he was sorry, though it wasn't his sorry to give. The sergeant only nodded. He hadn't come for an apology from the father. The third house was the hardest, not because the boy resisted, but because he cried, before the video even finished, sudden and unguarded, the kind of crying that surprises the person doing it. At each table, the demand was the same, delivered without raised voice, without threat, in the same worn, patient tone a man might use reading scripture he'd read 1,000 times and still believed, a letter, written by the boy's own hand, mailed to the nonprofit that had trained and placed that dog, describing exactly what happened and why it mattered. No fists, no shouting, no police called, just 3 boys, 3 kitchen tables, 3 sets of parents who would remember this longer than any punishment could have taught them, and 1 phone that stayed in the sergeant's pocket by the time he walked back out into the dark toward his bike, already thinking about the letters that hadn't been written yet, and whether they would be. The second house sat at the end of a gravel drive lined with dead sunflowers, their heads bowed toward a summer already gone. The father answered before the second knock, still in his work boots. A man built the way the county built men, wide through the shoulders, narrow through the patience. He watched the footage without blinking. He did not ask his son to explain himself. He did not raise his voice. He asked to see it again. The sergeant played it a second time, the small screen throwing pale light across the kitchen table, across the salt shaker, and the unopened mail, and the boy's hands, which had not stopped shaking since the first viewing. When it ended, the father sat with his forearms flat on the table, the way a man sits when he is bracing for something he already knows is coming. "I never sat him down," he said, "not once, not about anything that mattered." The sergeant said nothing. He had learned, decades ago, that silence pulled more truth out of a man than any question could. I was raised the same way, the father said. Nobody sat me down either. I told myself I'd do different. Guess I just didn't get around to it. He looked at his son then, not with anger, but with something closer to grief, the particular grief of a man watching his own failures repeat themselves in a smaller body across the table. That dog belongs to somebody who needs it to stay alive, the father said, mostly to the boy, though his eyes stayed on the sergeant. You understand that? Not a toy, not a joke, a woman's life. The boy nodded, unable to speak. The father exhaled through his nose, a long breath that seemed to cost him something. I didn't teach him what it costs when a thing like that goes missing. That's on me before it's on him. The sergeant only said, It's on both of you now. No absolution offered. No forgiveness extended on the club's behalf, because none was theirs to give. Just the demand, spoken plain, a letter, written in the boy's own hand, mailed to the nonprofit, telling the truth of what happened and why it mattered. The father nodded once, slow, like a man setting something down he'd carried too long without noticing the weight of it. Outside, the sergeant swung a leg over his bike and sat a moment before starting the engine, looking back at the porch light burning steady behind the screen door, thinking that some fathers only learned the shape of their failure when it wore their son's face and stood in a stranger's headlights, caught. The limp lasted 19 days. She counted them the way she'd once counted hours between watches overseas, marking each one against the way he set the paw down, the way weight shifted through his shoulder before it touched ground. On the first week he wouldn't put any pressure on it at all, and she carried water to him on the porch rather than make him rise. By the second week he was testing it, small experimental steps across the kitchen linoleum, and she watched with the specific attention of someone who had learned not to trust good news until it repeated itself 3 times in a row. On the 20th day he ran the length of the yard chasing nothing, some private momentum of his own, and she stood on the bottom step with her hand pressed flat against her chest and did not call him back. The letter from the nonprofit came on a Tuesday, forwarded from the chapter's post office box, thanking the club for its continued partnership and noting, in the careful language of people who did not want to embarrass anyone, that an anonymous contribution had been recorded toward the training of 2 future service animals currently in the pipeline. No name attached, no request for one. The sergeant read it twice at the counter of the feed store, folded it along its existing crease, and put it back in the envelope like a man returning something borrowed. The crate arrived without ceremony. A member she'd only nodded to before, heavy-set, quiet, hands permanently stained along the knuckles from decades of engine work, showed up on a Saturday morning with a magnetic locking unit still in its manufacturer's foam, and spent 2 hours bolting it into the bed of her truck while she brought him coffee she wasn't sure he wanted, and he drank anyway. He tested the latch 4 times before he was satisfied, pressing his thumb against the release and watching it resist. "Won't come off without the key," he said, not looking up from his work. "Not for hands that don't know where it lives." He didn't ask her to thank him, and she didn't try. Some gifts asked to be witnessed, and some asked only to be used, and this was the second kind, a piece of engineered indifference to anyone who wasn't her, bolted into the one place that had failed her once already, sitting now like a small steel promise she hadn't had to ask for twice. Radar rode in it the following Monday, back to the feed store, back past the boat ramp 62 miles out, that neither of them mentioned, his weight settled and even, no favor given to either leg, the vest's torn nylon replaced weeks earlier, and now bearing only the faint discoloration of a mend healed clean. By September, the light came sideways across the porch by 6, laying long gold bars over the boards, and she had learned to sit for it the way some people sit for church. The dog lay against her leg with his chin on her boot, his ribs rising and falling in a rhythm she had once needed a machine to measure, and now simply knew by feel, the way you know a clock is running without looking at it. The note was still taped to her door. She had not moved it in 4 months, not because she'd forgotten it was there, but because she hadn't found a reason good enough to take it down. The tape had yellowed at the corners. The handwriting, block letters, pressed hard enough to dent the paper, had not faded at all. "Found what's yours." She had turned those 3 words over more times than she could count, in the weeks after, in the ordinary Tuesdays that followed the extraordinary one. She had expected, when it was happening, that the men on the road that day would stay large in her mind, the way the day itself was large. 67 engines, chalk lines on a road atlas, a boy's father saying something quiet on a porch, 62 miles from this one. But that wasn't how it settled. What stayed was smaller. A CB radio crackling in a gas station she'd never visit again. A thumb pressed against a locking latch, testing it 4 times. A young woman with a new patch kneeling in creek mud, calling a dog's name like she'd known him her whole life. The loud ones, she thought, were never the ones you had to watch for. It was the quiet you learned to trust, the kind that showed up once, did the bolting or the finding or the driving, and then didn't need you to say anything about it afterward. The town still saw them the way it always had, leather and exhaust and folded arms outside the diner, and she understood now that this was by design, that the fear other people felt was a kind of camouflage the men themselves had stopped bothering to correct. The dog shifted against her leg, resettled, sighed the way he did when the day was fully over and nothing more was going to be asked of him. She put her hand on his side and felt the breath moving under her palm, steady, unhurried, the kind of steady that had once been the only warning she had before the ground came up to meet her. The porch light buzzed on above the door, catching the edge of the taped note, and she let it stay lit a while before she went in.